The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, this is Victoria Veal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and I'm very pleased to introduce a colleague, Josh Ford, who is going to be your moderator for this webinar.
Thank you, Victoria, and thanks for joining us today for our Funding Resources webinar hosted by Central Ohio APWA and LTAP. Presenting today are Betsy, Ehlers, Nicole, Waldheim, and Kendra Schenk, who are part of the funding experts team at Burgess and Niple. Betsy is a funding specialist in our Columbus office with 24 years of experience helping communities identify, author, and implement funding, and co-leads the firm's grant resources team. She has assisted in authoring $45 million in grants from various federal agencies, including US DOT, US EPA, and US EDA, as well as other state-specific programs. Nicole is the National Transportation Safety Lead for BNN with 19 years of experience, with the last 10 years focused on transportation safety. In her previous job, she supported the development of the Ohio Strategic Highway Safety Plan and managed 4 regional safety plans for MPOs and local agencies in Ohio. She is currently leading BNN's efforts to integrate the safe system approach into planning, leading projects for the FHWA, NCHRP, and several MPOs. Kendra is a traffic safety engineer at Burgess and Niple. She's also one of the first certified road safety professionals specializing in infrastructure in the country. Kendra's passion for safety is evident in her work across the country, helping local and state agencies achieve their goals of 0 deaths and serious injuries on the roadways. As Victoria mentioned, my name is Josh Ford, and I'm a board member for the Central Ohio branch of APWA, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Please enter your questions in the questions box, and we will cover those towards the end of the presentation. Now, without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Betsy.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to share some information today. We appreciate the opportunity to kind of go through some of the details that we've been combing regarding the new grant programs that are in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. I guess just to get started, it's pretty evident how the grants landscape has changed. Before you needed a magnifying glass and had to find that perfect fit, it was sometimes, very difficult. And, recently, there's a plethora of grants, and it's more about how to identify the qualities within each one that match your project. So, just to get started, we'll get right into it. Today, we're going to try to do 2 things. One, boil the ocean, if you will, speak to some of our sources and links and helpful information on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to help you decode the best of what can help your community or specific projects. We're going to share some major takeaways just that comes from reviewing a collection of information from a variety of sources. And we're going to give you our interpretations about things that we find are good takeaways for you to know and are very important as you consider how to prepare for additional grants that may come both from the U.S. Department of Transportation as well as other agencies. So in sharing that, we have a few caveats. The information that you'll see was extracted, as I mentioned, from multiple sources, and believe it or not, from the text of the law itself. It reflects our interpretation and the interpretations of others, and we share that with you with the idea that we're giving you some cliff notes to be able to better sleuth through to find what you need. We're going to share some links and kind of do that while we're presenting so that you can have those resources. I will also mention that the presentation handout here contains a lot of information, and we've provided it for you as a PDF that you can download in the WebEx. So you can go back to any slide and look for additional detail. The other thing I would just mention is that, again, the congressional intent that is in the bill, we've kind of extracted, but the agency itself, US DOT, will provide the details that are official details and those that you should follow in their NOFO or Notice of Funding Opportunity, and that they may, we'll give as much as we can. This is kind of what we know so far, and hopefully it's helpful to you. The other thing we want to do is cover 4 new programs. So kind of a deep dive, sharing lots of details, again, from the bill that are on the Safe Streets for All grants that are anticipated to come out in the second quarter of 2022, the Rural Surface Transportation grants that are anticipated here yet in the first quarter, at least that was what was in the White House briefing. We're going to speak to you about the Protect grants, which are brand new and include lots of potential for resilience components that we found very interesting. And then lastly, we'll speak to the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. So, I found this interesting. Just yesterday, the Transportation for America, put their own interpretation of the law up on their website and this portal. And I love these buttons. You kind of have to choose your starting point, either start me with the basics or toss me in the deep end. We have a little bit of both in this presentation. And I guess just, the goal is to unpack the components that might be of most interest that have come from the law. So deciphering and decoding the things that are important. You'll notice in the presentation, that I've included links, and these are live links. They provide lots of information, and you can go to those to be able to get some additional details. But from a start me with the basics component, one of the most frequent questions that I received in our discussions internally just for how to break down the funding is, tell me what's different, tell me what's changing, and tell me what stays the same. As you look at the Act, which is commonly called either the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, $550 billion of the total is new. And I love this graph that was provided from Clark Hill in one of their webinars, and also as referenced in the National Association of Counties. If you look here, $284 billion is for transportation. And then there's $266 billion for other infrastructure sectors. So today we're really going to focus on a few components of the transportation offering, but just know that there is considerable other grant opportunities for water, broadband, energy and power, environmental remediation, and resiliency that are also included in the Act. So again, just focusing on what is new, and specifically within this allocation, what's new for transportation. So kind of, on that Where's Waldo theme, these are the new transportation grant programs that are listed in the bill. And we're going to touch on, 3 that are indicated in this list. But, Safe Streets for All program, a Federal Aviation Administration program, promoting resilient operations for transformative, efficient, and cost saving. As I mentioned, considerable funds for resiliency. Some funding for ferries, the Federal Highway Administration grants for nationally significant bridges is included, charging and fueling infrastructure, the Reconnecting Communities, which we'll share more details on, and then a new program, $1 billion for strengthening mobility and revolutionizing transportation, or SMART grants, to states and local governments. We're going to go through these in more detail. So these are the new grant programs. So turns out you can't really boil the ocean, but you can know where to look. And, this slide was developed to sort of share the best of all the resources that I have linked and bookmarked on my computer. And again, if you're looking for a specific resource to provide you with additional detail, I think one of the best ones is this Brookings Institute has put forth a portal. And hopefully you can see this okay. I just want to show you a couple of ways that you can navigate. Brookings has built their federal infrastructure hub here, and it's very conducive to finding your interests. So transportation, energy, broadband, you can see as you click here, it opens potential sectors. If you want to see just the transportation things that are linked, they pull up in the table in such a way so that you can sort and find, what is of greatest interest in the bridge investment program. You can click any one of these potential things that were included. Within here, you can go even further and follow one of the links associated with this specific program to be able to get more details. So just know that those links are very helpful in terms of looking for your specific area of interest. And Brookings Institute, is one that is very good. The other that has come out is this U.S. Department of Transportation has loaded their bipartisan infrastructure portal with the idea that if you frequent this page, you'll see new information that's come forward. It's also organized by categories. So if you're interested in a specific discipline, rail, transit, FHA, you can go deeper and look for additional information. They've created this specific portal, so I wanted to familiarize you with that. Additionally, many folks in our office found the White House guidebook, at least some sections, a pretty easy read in terms of looking at some steps for tracking information. This is sort of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law guidebook that was released, and it breaks down, you'll see this, the Building a Better America and the specific parts. You can click based on interest for additional information, so wanted to share that with you. And then, the National Association of Regional Councils has put out a really good summary. It's here. And I wanted to share this. So this is USDOT's their deck that has come up in several different presentations. I've attended a couple of conferences and seen various portions of these slides. This has slides that I'm going to reference today, but it includes their comprehensive summary of all the different programs thus far with details from the bill. So just know that that's available to you as well. And then, lastly, the text of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is also included in here. It is a searchable version, so you can, type in what your area of interest is and look for specific details. Again, that's what we tried to do as well, to be able to extrapolate information. So some major takeaways, just for novices as you try and look at the information, there's more in this bipartisan infrastructure law than ever before for local governments. And so before, where you had to go through a state allocation or apply through a state program, other than some traditional funding programs like Infra and RAISE, what used to be called Tiger, where you could apply directly as a local government to USDOT. There's more than ever before where the eligible applicant is a local government or an NPO. So this is again referencing one of the slides from that USDOT deck and shows you some of the program examples and just how many opportunities are available for local governments to directly apply. The other big takeaway is, and you'll see this in the breakdown of information, the discretionary versus formula allocations of funding. So a discretionary grant is one where you can apply directly and you are scored and evaluated and you receive feedback in terms of whether you've won or lost the potential grant that you apply for. Each part of the law, and they reference different terms in terms of contract authority, advance appropriations. Just as you peek at those, some funds are immediately available. Others, they have the authority to go out, but they're waiting on, the authorization for that specific component. So you'll see in that USDOT slide deck a very helpful reference of sort of discretionary versus formula and how that fits with the different programs. And then lastly, just a big takeaway, USDOT came out with a policy memorandum that includes overarching principles. I've included that in here, and it references some key criteria that you could consider in terms of how does my project align overall. That memo, sets forth some initial building blocks for the consideration of evaluating projects for all of the USDOT programs. And, the big takeaway with that is if you consider that USDOT will be developing, evaluation criteria and referencing that memo, again, you could interpret that things that are identified in the memo are things that are important or may be important in the later scoring of projects. So I share this with you as you consider a project and you're trying to line up funding that is a best match. These are some of the components of that memo. Does your project, is it going to be consistent with a larger or regional plan or an asset plan? What are the components of your project that promote safety? How is your project accessible to all, or how can you include portions of your project to be more accessible? We talk about resilience and the components of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that reference resilience. How can your project be more green, be more resilient? How does it include new technologies, and how will it, help to reconnect areas into some of the prioritizations that have come through from President Biden's executive order to address historically disadvantaged communities or areas of persistent poverty. And then, lastly, how is your project efficient and effective? So traditionally in a construction grant, you would submit a benefit cost analysis that would look at defining return on investment and that efficiency and effectiveness. Another thing we wanted to share with you today, again, just from our interpretation, some things that are going to be really important for you to know about how your project might fit. And again, this is across, potentially all of the USDOT programs, especially those that are indicated as rural, which Kendra is going to talk about a specific new grant opportunity that touches rural communities. You'll need to define whether or not your project is located in an urban or rural area. And we just saw this in the notice of funding opportunity for the RAISE grants through USDOT. And, why is this important in terms of defining where your project sits? And again, here's another live link just to show you, you can go in. It will take you to a mapper. You can look for the list of urban areas, so look for, they're using the 2010 census, or at least they did specific to the RAISE grant. You can go in here and try and figure out, am I within an urban area? And if so, how can I then determine whether my project is within that or not? For the specific RAISE grant, they define an urbanized area as one with a population of greater than 200,000. And rural as all other projects, that are outside of that urbanized area. I wanted to just kind of share again, this is another link that I thought was really helpful, where it breaks it out and sends you to a map so that you can check out your project area. I think this is maybe important in terms of, depending on your defined fit into either a rural or urban area. There may be thresholds that are included in NOFOs that are forthcoming. So for example, in the RAISE grant, if you were located within an urban area, your project was deemed urban, the minimum amount that you were able to apply for either for construction or planning was $5 million. So, there may be some additional threshold criteria or requirements that fit with that urban and rural definition, and trying to determine, how you fit and how you would be defined specific to the program is something just to kind of consider now, so that when you see those notices of funding, you'll have a better idea of how that works. The other very important criteria was to try and figure out if your project is located in one of the potential areas that are either a transportation disadvantage census tract defined by USDOT, or in an area of persistent poverty. They have again included a mapping dashboard so that you can kind of go in and look for your specific project area. Looks like that's not going to let me do that here, but you can go back into the link and be able to pull that up to define whether or not you're in one of these yellow areas. So, this is for a disadvantaged census tract. You can see they're defined here in yellow. Ohio has 735 that are defined. And, the goal here would be to be able to identify if your project is in one of those areas or benefits one of those areas, how to pull that through in the grant application so that you can, have it be considered or evaluated as an important factor. The other thing I just want to familiarize folks with is the BCA. Folks that have applied before through USDOT for a construction type grant, you know, they do require a BCA or a benefit cost analysis. As I mentioned before, you know, that is an evaluation of the quantified benefits that if USDOT invests in your project, you want a return of greater than 1, and the higher your rate of return for benefit across various components, you know, the greater the potential of investment benefits if USDOT would fund your project. There's a very detailed guidelines for how you prepare that BCA. Again, this is typically and traditionally required of construction type grants, not planning. So planning grants typically would not require a BCA, but if you intend to apply for a construction grant with USDOT, you know, you'll need to put a BCA together and include data that references, you know, how your project will provide an efficient and economic benefit. So I did note that USDOT, as of yesterday, when you go to click their page for guidelines regarding that, they talk about updates are coming soon. And so, you know, just know that that's an important step as you plan to do a construction grant, familiarizing yourself with the BCA process. So with that, again, we're in the deep dive part of selecting buttons and want to share some additional information with you about the specific programs, the 4 programs. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nicole to discuss the Safe Streets for All grant.
Great, thanks, Betsy. If you could go to the next slide there. So it's not that transportation safety became more important all of a sudden, but there is even more of a focus on it now. So in January, the USDOT released their National Roadway Safety Strategy, and it does a few important things. 1, 0 fatalities is officially endorsed as the national goal. And then 2, the strategy supports the adoption of the safe system approach as that method or process to get to 0. So it doesn't detail the funding opportunities in here, but the Safe Streets for All discretionary grant really is the biggest competitive grant program set up to fund this type of work that's recognized in the strategy. So the link to the strategy is on the slide, and it provides really good context on where the national discourse and priorities for safety are really headed. So next slide, Betsy. The Safe Streets and Roads for All grant is a completely new competitive program that's been added. The pot of money is focused solely on helping MPOs and local agencies, and you can use it either to, 1, develop a plan to identify the challenges and solutions to make progress towards 0 fatalities, or 2, to implement a safety project or program that's already been identified in a safety plan. So it's pretty concise and it's pretty clear where the money is going to be going for this particular grant program. As an aside, there are several existing formula fund programs that have been expanded. So the Highway Safety Improvement Program, the Transportation Alternatives Program, and the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program. So it would definitely be worth checking in with ODOT and or your MPO if you're with a local agency to really understand how they're going to be utilizing those additional resources for safety, and whether that could also create any new opportunities outside of this grant program. There is, again, significantly more money in this bill for safety in general. So next slide. So doesn't look like it advanced on my end, but Betsy, did it advance on yours? There we go. Okay. So Ohio has definitely always been very proactive when it comes to safety. The state adopted a goal of towards 0 deaths and has been supporting the implementation of roadway, bicycle, pedestrian safety projects on the state and the local system. ODOT has also been funding the development of local and regional safety plans across the state to really further identify those safety solutions on the local system. There's a ton of good examples to model your applications on, either for a plan or a project, and I'll talk about some of those in a couple of slides. But you know, as you can see from this figure, more can still be done to get Ohio closer to that goal of zero, and this grant and the development or implementation of a plan will just be another step in the right direction. Next slide, please. So here are the funding parameters for this grant. The total potential grant allocation over 5 years is $5 billion, so about $1 billion a year. But as of right now, the legislation specifies that at least $200 million will be awarded each year. So that's something that we just don't quite know the answer on yet, but anywhere from $200 million to $1 billion per year. There will need to be some level of coordination on who is submitting grants in Ohio, since no more than 15% of these funds can go to individual states per year. Nationally, so not just Ohio, but nationally, 40% of the funds will go to safety plans and 60% will go to safety projects. There will also be a 20% local match for these grants. So a lot to think about before applying. You know, who else in Ohio is pursuing this? Would it be better to pursue a plan or a project? And is the local match, you know, doable? As of right now, Betsy kind of talked a little bit about this. There's no minimum dollar requirement for this particular grant application, but it might be specified once the notice of funding comes out. So this could also have implications on, you know, who's able to apply. So, for example, if the minimum is, say, I don't know, $500,000 to $1 million, you know, locals would just really need to consider if they can make that match or just have a big enough plan or project to meet that minimum. But again, this is something to think about, but not something that we know for sure yet if there'll be a minimum dollar amount built in. Next slide. So the overall purpose of the grant is to support MPOs and locals in their efforts to develop and implement actions that mitigate and prevent severe crashes. A plan or a project that is developed using stakeholder engagement, considers innovative approaches, impacts a larger geographical area, advances equity, which Betsy showed you that tool to kind of look and see if you're in an equity area, is proven to work, are really going to score better. So when you're thinking about your plans or projects, you know, that's something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind here is that larger geographical footprint piece. So because there is a match and because each state can only receive 15% of the overall funds per year, it'll be really important to think about partnerships for these grants, especially if you're in a less populated area. So if you're in a town or, you know, a city, think about maybe partnering up to suggest something at the county level, or even maybe further up than that at the regional level. Next slide. So I already kind of outlined this, but, you know, again, this grant money is really only for these two purposes, to develop that comprehensive safety action plan. And don't get too tripped up, I think, on the language here. This can be a Vision Zero plan. It could be a local road safety plan, a regional safety plan, a Towards Zero Deaths plan. It really doesn't matter what you call it. But you do need to utilize a planning process that identifies strategies and projects to mitigate and prevent severe crashes. The money's also available to carry out associated plans, strategies, and projects identified in that comprehensive safety action plan. As far as I can tell right now, again, this is something to be determined later, the money does seem to be eligible for behavioral and engineering solutions, but again, that's another clarification to look for when the notice of funding comes out. For MPOs and locals who haven't developed a plan but are interested in doing so, there's some really good examples that already exist within Ohio. The City of Columbus did develop a Vision Zero specific plan. It has an associated action plan. The one shown on the slide here is the Eastgate Regional Council of Government Safety Plan. I did embed the link for this plan on the picture on the slide, but again, I think another good example if you're looking to go for funding to develop that safety plan. For those that do have a safety plan in place, this is an opportunity to fund those priority improvements in your document. ODOT and several local agencies, again like the City of Columbus or even Champaign County, have been implementing safety improvements, and just would be good agencies to discuss ideas with about how to prioritize your own improvements that you have in your plan and what might be the best to put forward for this type of funding. Next slide. So I've touched on this a little bit, and I know Betsy kind of focused early on that table about, this is a really good resource for local agencies who are looking for more funding. So you can see here who's eligible. It is MPOs, it is local governments, and then as I kind of alluded to with that geographical reach, they are really looking for multi-jurisdictional groups to kind of put their heads together and figure out a plan or a project that really makes the most sense. And while ODOT can't be an applicant, I mentioned this on my last slide, I do think they're an excellent resource to share example plans, planning processes, and or help with that project identification and prioritization. Next slide. So unlike the Highway Safety Improvement Program, where the types of projects that can be funded are very clearly spelled out, this grant does not specify, at least not yet, and they may not at all, what types of improvements are eligible for funding. So at this point, there's no prescriptive thing that will be funded. So I think in lieu of that, it's really important to consider the types of things that would really work in your region, or what are the things that have been proven to work in Ohio. This slide just shows a few examples of safety programs and projects that, as of right now, would definitely be eligible without any strict parameters in place. And again, not specified, but I do think these monies would be eligible for engineering and behavioral activities. And then next slide, just to wrap this up, this section. It's really not too early to start thinking about a grant for 2022, or maybe even better is 2023. The first round of applications is anticipated for this May. So I think to meet that particular deadline, start thinking about what you want to apply for. Is it a plan, or do you have a project that's ready? I would say collaborate locally and regionally to really expand that geographical reach. And then with the limitations on each state's funding, potentially coordinating with ODOT, or at least, more so in the region on what's going to be submitted, will be really important. So with that, I'm going to stop and conclude the Safe Streets for All. And I think, Betsy, you had an interim slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kendra to talk about a different grant program.
We've got no questions right now, so let's go ahead and continue on with Kendra.
All right, thank you, everyone. So I'm going to talk about the Rural Surface Transportation Grants. So next slide, please. So some key takeaways before we dive into the details. Like all of these grants we're talking about, this is a new funding source within the bill and is not related to HSIP or other safety funding sources. Again, this is a discretionary grant, so projects are awarded on an annual basis through a competitive funding process. The goal of this grant is to improve and expand the surface transportation infrastructure in rural areas. And to achieve this goal, $2 billion is being allocated through fiscal year 26. And state DOTs, rural transportation planning organizations, and local and tribal governments are eligible to apply for this grant. Next slide, please. So these grants are for projects in rural areas, which, as Betsy mentioned earlier, are for those areas that are outside of a designated urban area with a population of over 200,000 people. But really the goals of this program are to increase the connectivity and improve the safety and reliability of the movement of people and freight and to generate regional economic growth and improve the quality of life for those citizens in rural areas. Next slide, please. So again, we don't have a notice of funding opportunity yet, but what we know about from the information that's been published so far, $2 billion are going to be allocated between fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 26. Less than 10% of these grants will be awarded to small projects or those projects that are under $25 million. So you can see here they're really asking for large projects. So only 10% will be under that $25 million cap. And 25% of the grant will be awarded to designated routes of the Appalachian Development Highway System, and 15% of the funding will be allocated to projects to mitigate runoff the road crashes in those states with higher than average rural roadway lane departure fatalities. To my knowledge, that's not Ohio, but I haven't checked the latest data on that yet. But I know that we have some roadway departure fatalities, but I think there are other states that are higher than average. But like the other grant we talked about, the maximum award will be 80% of the total project cost, meaning there's going to be some sort of a local match at 20%. Again, we don't know what that looks like, but that's what we know so far. Next slide, please. Essentially, all state and local agencies are eligible for this funding opportunity. Rural transportation planning organizations, because they cover those rural areas, are eligible, whereas MPOs are not because of their urban context. And like Nicole said, for the Safe Streets for All grants, these multidisciplinary or multi-jurisdictional groups can apply, which may actually make the application more attractive because of the multiple levels of support for the project, especially as they're large. So next slide, please. Right now, there's a pretty good list of the eligible projects that we could be used for this grant. So here's some examples. Highway, bridge, or tunnel projects that are eligible under the National Highway Performance Program, the Surface Transportation Block Grant, or the Tribal Transportation Program. Highway freight projects that are eligible under the National Highway Freight Program, highway safety improvement projects, and projects that are on a publicly owned highway or bridge that improve access to certain facilities that support the economy of a rural area, and integrated mobility management systems, transportation demand management systems, or on-demand mobility services are also eligible under this grant. Next slide, please. So like several of the grants, the eligible funding uses include both construction and pre-construction activities. So planning, feasibility analyses, revenue forecasting, environmental review, preliminary engineering, and design are all considered eligible under this grant, as well as the overall construction. So the requirements state, at least what we know so far, that the project should generate regional economic mobility or safety benefits while being cost effective. The project should also contribute to one or more of the national goals outlined in Section 150. The project must also have some level of preliminary engineering completed to determine if it will meet one of these goals and the criteria associated with the grant. But perhaps most importantly, the project should be reasonably expected to begin construction not later than 18 months after the date of the funds being awarded. So again, having that level of preliminary engineering in place so that when awarded, if you're doing pre-construction activities, can be completed and construction started within 18 months. Next slide, please. Because these projects are large, there's a topic about bundling projects. So part of the provisions of the grant, these projects could be bundled if they are if they're bundled under the statewide transportation improvement program in accordance with Section 135. And so long as the projects are going to be awarded to a single contractor or consultant. So for the purposes of this application, bundled projects would be considered just one application. So next slide, please. So potential example projects, again, like Nicole mentioned, we don't have super specific examples, but here's some that we thought of. Grade separation of a highway or intersection or a railroad crossing. You could do widening of a rural roadway to include passing or climbing lanes. You could have a major interchange reconstruction within a rural area. You can construct a road at a new location. So to implement and improve the economy in the rural area and livability, it could be an entirely new roadway connection, or it could be to realign a roadway on its existing alignment because of safety purposes. Similarly, you could realign some curves for safety purposes to reduce those roadway departure fatalities and crashes. Next slide, please. So the evaluation criteria for this grant has been published and established. Hitting the high points here, this project is going to be evaluated on its ability to improve the state of existing highway, bridge, and tunnel facilities, and to increase the capacity or connectivity to improve mobility for those residents in rural areas. That includes improved access to emergency care and other healthcare needs. Other evaluation criteria would include if the project addresses economic development and job creation challenges, but also enhances recreation and tourism opportunities by providing access to parks and other recreational areas. And the project could also strive to use innovative product delivery approaches or incorporate transportation technologies. But this grant, while there's no specific provision as to how much money will be allocated to each state, that is an evaluation criteria about the geographic diversity among the grant recipients. And lastly, looking at, the grant will make sure that it's spread across the country. So it's not just going to be all Ohio or a handful of states. Next slide, please. So here's some next steps to prepare. Again, there's some things we've brainstormed. There's obviously lots of things that you can do. This grant is due out yet this quarter, so we're not really sure when it's going to drop in the next month or so and what that notice of funding opportunity will look like. But you can start by identifying those roadways and intersections with high crash frequencies or areas where development may occur and you may need some roadway improvements, especially if it's for economic growth or job creation in those rural areas. You can coordinate with your key stakeholders to start gathering consensus and support for advancing this project. Again, the large dollar amounts will need local match. So coordinating on that, getting a preliminary engineering estimate to determine the amount of local share that would be required and to make sure that it meets the funding requirements within the Rural Surface Transportation Grant guidelines. So with that, I will pause here for questions on the Rural Transportation Grant. I know this picture, I feel like, sums up a lot of what we're talking about.
No questions yet, so we can go ahead and wrap it up.
All right. Betsy, if you're talking, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was just trying to get to the right button. Yeah, so lastly, we want to touch on just 2 additional new grant opportunities that are defined in the bill. This one I found fascinating, the PROTECT program. You know, again, we talked about the connectivity of resiliency being built into a lot of the definitive criteria. And, you know, the PROTECT grants, they're going to be in 4 different categories: planning grants, resilience improvement grants, community resilience and evacuation route grants. And then there is a coastal component, which, you know, at-risk coastal infrastructure grants, which you'll probably see more on the national scale. The PROTECT grants, you know, are focused on making those resilience improvements that are sort of necessary in and around transportation investments. So just know that those are forthcoming. As you look at the allocations, you know, basically a considerable amount of funding that will be distributed to states. And then again, as we talked about, discretionary funding or competitive grants, both for states and other partners and applicants to seek some of these resilience components that are being built into the law. These are 2 slides here. You know, this one speaks to the state allocation from the PROTECT formula, again, focused on those planning, resilience improvements, community resilience overall, and some of that evacuation and coastal infrastructure. Traditionally in the past, when I first read through all this criteria, you know, new FEMA program, the BRIC program, which started last year, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, has some overlap with some of the things that I was seeing in terms of the protection provisions for infrastructure and resilience. So take a look at this. On the grants that are applicable, again, here local governments have a portion, this $1.4 billion that will come forward, or we anticipate to come forward for discretionary grants to fund components. They mention here, highway transit, intercity passenger rail, port facilities, resilience planning activities, including planning and construction, to be a component of these potential grants. They do define in the bill that there is a higher share per state if the state has, a resilience improvement plan, and the state or MPO sort of incorporates that plan into its long-range transportation planning. So some components I think that are yet to come and will be further developed out, at least in Ohio. Again, this is referencing a slide that was included in USDOT's deck as a source, but I think just for your reference as we try and build these components into projects, this is the way that they're defining a resilience improvement, including natural infrastructure, so those green infrastructure components, and the potential that you could better anticipate for and prepare for, withstanding any disruptions or natural disasters and weather events. Those components, kind of if you read through, they incorporate, if you have a construction activity to improve the ability of an existing surface transportation asset to be able to withstand these components by setting in place a resilience investment. I'm excited to see what these bring forward, because traditionally these types of improvements, there were not grants that were easily available or could be accessed for these sort of special items that bring in this natural infrastructure. There is a big planning grant component that's defined in the bill for this as well. I talked about that state plan, but also other planning that could be used by a consortium of entities or district or MPO to be able to build capacity for identifying strategies to meet with resilience plans. So I thought this was very interesting in terms of something to watch out for. And then within the bill itself, these, while this is a lot of text, and forgive all the details, something you can revisit, there's some good stuff in here. Right in the law, it basically says that you can incorporate natural infrastructure and that that's an eligible activity under this resilience improvement component. They talk about relocating roadways in a base floodplain to higher ground, kind of lengthening and raising bridges, drainage components, pretty cool stuff with the potential to improve and incorporate some green infrastructure and green stormwater components into transportation improvements. So we'll be excited to see that come out. And then lastly, in terms of details specific to a new grant program, something, included is this Reconnecting Communities pilot grant, of which there is $150 million over 5 years for planning in this pilot program. Where, this is excerpted from the White House briefing document and some of the information from the National Association of Counties. So as a source, carrying out feasibility studies on the impact or mitigating physical infrastructure built, barriers. So somewhere where a transportation asset was laid into place that caused disruption and changed, or created a disadvantage in an area, it's the repair and restoration of improvements that would mitigate those type of improvement projects, but both planning and construction included. So $350 million in the capital construction portion to be able to remove those specific barriers that are defined as an eligible facility here, and then create a different reconnection for those facilities. So again, I think this is just something that's very unique and will have the potential in different areas in terms of an application to address where there would have been an asset that maybe created a disadvantage, how that might be addressed to be able to move forward into the future. Again, this new competitive program, just both local governments and states have a component in terms of that eligibility. They do define a planning grant, at a $2 million threshold and, a $5 million for a capital construction project in terms of some of those criteria for minimum grants. And then, I thought this was interesting, feasibility and impacts of removing, retrofitting, or mitigating that existing facility as we talked about. So, and same for planning. Some additional details here for you in terms of, hey, what does a planning grant look like under this and how are they defining that further? Some additional detail, even including the public engagement component and some of the pieces that are a part of that. So new pilot program, and we'll be watching, for additional details. I think as we kind of wind down here, I want to save some time. So, in closing, what can you do in the interim from a general scale if you have a potential project and you're trying to fit it or see if it's a match again with these potential programs? These are just some helpful things that we would share. As you calibrate what those projects are, take a look at that memo from USDOT and, try and incorporate those potential things into your project. Another thing I always encourage people to do is to have a one-page project fact sheet about the project that you would like to do built that you can hand to people and begin obtaining support. Often USDOT grants are really three parts. They are federal grants that require, federal support and other support in order to be able to demonstrate benefit. They include a project narrative and a BCA. The fastest way to get that support started for a potential project is to have a fact sheet and can help, coalition build to be able to drive other project beneficiaries into your, overall approach. So it can be a very useful tool to help you identify other community benefactors or people who can contribute to your project and participate. The other thing, as we referenced in the beginning part of this presentation, so if you joined late, we had some pretty cool links in here in terms of mapping capability for your specific project in categories like urban or rural. And if your project sits in an area of persistent poverty or a disadvantaged census tract, those are great things to know as you kind of look to where you would make investments and can prioritize based on evaluation criteria that's not all, come out yet. So take a peek at how your project fits. The other thing I would say is if you're considering, a construction request, consider beginning your prerequisites, that feasibility study or the preliminary engineering. Those things will be essential in building the data that's necessary for the BCA, again, if you're applying for construction. And to start those sort of in advance as you look at this implementation of funding, it goes 2022 to 2026. So trying to align what needs to be done when so that you can have the pieces together for the year with which you intend to apply for construction. And then, match is always critically important. So while some programs, have some criteria that allow for more match, that standard federal 80-20, what will your commitment be in terms of how you'll meet that match criteria for what's required for your project. And then lastly, both the state agencies and some of the agencies, including USDOT, if you can get feedback on how your project aligns with some of the grant programs, in advance of when the notice of funding comes out, or have dialogue to be able to take useful feedback and build it into your project. These are some things that we're encouraging folks to do in the interim, or helping to provide resources and tools like the right links to look up this criteria to help you prepare. So with that, I guess I just want to extend, personally, it's great to be able to share information about something that we're passionate about. While this is a tremendous amount of information and we recognize that, our goal was to empower folks with enough information to help better make decisions. And so if you do have any questions, or as you revisit these slides and have need for additional information or want some additional clarification, don't hesitate to reach out to Victoria, and we'll look through any questions and be able to respond as quickly as we can. And I guess with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Josh, for any questions or closing comments. And again, thank you.
Well, we've got it open right now, audience, for any questions. Right now, we don't have anything up.
Josh, this is Victoria. They've been a very quiet group today. I think they've been basically drinking from the fire hydrant here. You guys have done a fantastic job. Thank you so much for the webinar.
Yep, thanks, Victoria, and all those in the audience. The handout that you've got has contact info for Betsy, Nicole, and Kendra. So if you go through this or have some specific instances where you have questions that come up, please feel free to reach out to them, and they'll help you out as soon as they can. So I think with that, we don't have any new questions coming in, so we can go ahead and close this webinar. Thanks for joining. Oh, hold on, we do have one here. Just great explanation, really appreciate it. So seems we're having some comments come in that it was some good content. So thanks a lot, Betsy, Kendra, and Nicole.
Thank you all. Everyone have a great rest of your weekend. Take care.